First of all, I want to say that Sharon and I didn't kind of rehearse our pieces together, really, and we had a bit of debate about who was going to go first and who was going to go second. So of necessity, there will be a little bit of repetition. But as my Benedictine kind of scholars once taught me when I was in a monastery, repetitio est mater studiorum. For those of you who know your Latin, repetition is the mother of study, but of course it could also be the mother of boreordom, and I hope that won't happen. Now, I was asked to talk about globalization, health, and trade in a very large context, in a very large sense. So my view on this is really going to be from what I would say is 36,000 feet. But that's somewhat appropriate because I spent 2 days at that altitude getting here. Now, the first is let's dispose of the notion of globalization. And we know kind of broadly what it is in terms of this integration, this kind of sharing, this cognitive changes, temporal changes, but more importantly, the economic changes. Now, there's nothing new about globalization, right? And there's nothing new about the fact that trade has always been an element of this kind of globalizing sort of process of human history. But we do know that it's been quite new since the post-1970s. Has been the establishment of very firm rules about trade liberalization at multilateral levels, the growing dominance of transnational corporations, the huge scale of capital mobility and the speed with which it is crossing borders, and then the rise of intra-firm trade and of global production chains. But we need to recognize, as Sharon did in more detail, that the health gains of this globally integrating past half century have been actually fairly substantial. So significant improvements, particularly in the period of the golden years after the Second World War. Health inequalities declined, and generally things looked fairly good. And some of the reasons for this that have been speculated or kind of identified in the research literature, one of them is this rapid diffusion of new health technologies. Now that means health knowledge and health systems thinking, and not just kind of like magic pills, but health technologies in a broad sense. And we know that with the with the growth of intellectual property right regimes, some of this ability of rapid diffusion of this knowledge is beginning to sort of shrink. We saw the child health revolution that was led by groups like UNICEF and the WHO. But also kind of gender rights, democratic rights in the sense of increased global obligation that's really kind of stands most starkly for us with the Millennium Development Goals. But then along came the oil cartels, the high inflation rates in the USA, the Volcker shock, all of which contributed to the developing world debt crisis, and the rise of a neoliberal economic orthodoxy. So my sociologist or political science roots are showing in terms of wanting to frame this in the context of theories of neoliberalism. What later became known as the Washington Consensus, which was essentially a set of policy prescriptions intended to allow indebted low and middle income countries to pay back their high income creditors. And the reason for calling this neoliberalism 1.0 will become apparent as my talk progresses. So what has happened to health since? Well, we know that there's been a slowing in some parts of the world and reversals in other parts. We also know that income inequalities began to rise in the 1980s, and by the 1990s, this period of health convergence globally began to go into a period of divergence once more. Now, at the same time, I mean, health continued to improve. And we see this in terms of looking at some of the life expectancies at birth by Human Development Index groups. So, some substantial gains. But one of the studies that we did for our Globalization Knowledge Network actually looked at what would have happened if the health gains in the 1970s through to the 1980s had continued in the 1990s to the 2000s. And what it said is against that counterfactual, globalization-related policies accounted for a decrease globally of about 1.5 years of potential life years, and led to some fairly substantial reversals in places like in Africa and in the transition economies in the former USSR. So we have a mixed picture. So things still are getting better, but they could be getting better. And we are still left with a 21-year gap between the aggregate of low-income countries and the aggregate of high-income countries. So we could be doing much, much more. Now this brings me to then saying, if we talk about some of the positive health claims, what about the claim about economic growth, the kind of trickle-down health that occurs under conditions of liberalization and global market integration? So this is a pretty standard argument that I'm sure most of you are familiar with, that when countries liberalize, they grow. When they grow, they become wealthy. When they become wealthy, that they can decrease poverty. And if they decrease poverty, people get healthier, and healthier people, as Sharon pointed out, can be more productive in the economy. So they grow more. So we have a virtuous circle. And this is an argument that's generally made in favor of trade liberalization. And there is some affirming evidence for each of these links, but also many caveats. So it's generally accepted that liberalization on average will improve economic growth, but a recent review of the econometric studies on this relationship found that it does for some and it doesn't for others, and it, quote, all depends. And what it depends on is the pace of liberalization, a country's pre-existing productive assets, the rules of trade and who sets them, the role of redistributive or shock buffering domestic policies, and the role of trade treaties in continually and slowly eroding what is now described as policy space, and what others would describe as shrinking the capacity of the developmental state to grow its domestic economy using exactly the same kind of tools by which every other wealthier country today grew their domestic economies. Now, as for poverty, extreme poverty has fallen in all of the world's regions, although much less so in Africa, as these slides show. And only in the last 10 years has Africa seen any proportional slight decline in extreme poverty, but in absolute numbers terms, a fairly substantial rise in extreme poverty. And globally, the number of people below the extreme poverty level rates has fallen from about 5 billion in 1981 to just over 3.5 billion in 2008. And that's an amazing accomplishment. But to put it into context, this was a period of time during which the global economy quadrupled. So once again, we have a case of is growth kind of leading us in this direction? Is it coincidental? How effective is it actually being in reducing poverty? And the World Bank economist who's responsible for looking at all this and reached a rather striking conclusion that it's hard to maintain the view that expanding external trade is a powerful force for poverty reduction. And even the recent Human Development Index 2013, in tracking some of these changes, noted that there was some improvements in the Human Development Index for countries that are associated with trade, but for other countries, very little improvement. So it keeps taking us back to this concept that it all depends, and the need to sort of disaggregate and look very carefully at what countries' conditions are and how the trade liberalization affects their potential for growth over time. So extreme trade protectionism appears to be associated with a lack of development in terms of health or human development, and trade may be a usefully necessary ingredient in growth and poverty reduction, but it is insufficient in itself and probably far less of a force in poverty reduction or in human development than most trade economists would reckon. And development economist Nancy Birdsall commented on why this is so in her 2006 wider lecture, where she was drawing on an extensive body of empirical work. And she argues that the reasons for this lie in the inherently asymmetrical nature of globalization. So wealthier, well-endowed countries do better. Low and middle-income countries, especially poorer ones, have lacked the capacity to actually deal with all of the kind of perturbations in their labor or kind of social markets and economic markets, in that the rules tend to favor the rich, who have the ability to sort of exert the power in terms of creating what those rules will be in their favor. And her last point, I think, is particularly relevant to the discussions that will follow today in terms of the TPPA. Now, a very similar conclusion to Birdsall's was reached by another economist who was using data from up to 2005, and according to 4 different scenarios using general equilibrium models of a completion of a WTO Doha round, essentially found that the low-income countries would lose, and the usual gang of suspects of high-income countries would gain most. So China, though, would be up on top for reasons that we can probably well understand. And I think that findings like this probably explain why there is such a low level of interest in multilateral trade negotiations at the WTO, and such a wide and gaining interest in regional and bilateral treaties. These findings now predate the great global financial crisis, which in turn birthed the Great Recession and then the austerity agenda, both of which have enormous implications for health and development. So what do we mean by kind of this great financial crisis? Where did it come from? And the roots of this I would describe as neoliberalism 2.0. So liberalization in trade in goods has always been accompanied by liberalization in capital flows. And this has created, along with technology and deregulation in some of the high-income countries, this has created an enormous financialized economy divorced from any of the normal realms of the so-called real economy of production and consumption. And the scale of this is absolutely stunning. Over $3.7 trillion in highly leveraged speculative currency trades occurred daily in 2007. You know, far outstripping what the annual total of foreign direct investment was over the course of the entire year. There was a slight drop in 2008 and 2009, but it's rebounded to over $5 trillion in 2011, kind of a clear signal that our financialized funny money economy has not yet learned the lessons of the financial meltdown in 2007. And there's some enormous health costs that have been associated with this. And like most global economic meltdowns, these costs are borne first by the people least responsible for creating and certainly not benefiting from the practices that led to the crisis in the first instance. So Africa kind of fares worst in this. Notice in particular the huge increase in unemployment. And for those who are able to find employment, increasingly that employment has been termed precarious employment, the rise of the precariat. In Canada right now, 20% of all employment is in the precarious sector. In Latin America, 60% of all of the urban employment in Latin America is in the precarious sector. Right? Multiple job holdings, no security, inadequate wages or income, and also when it's in that kind of sector, less able for governments to sort of essentially tax the labor markets for redistributive purposes. Now, the health cost of this is very high, but they're trivial when we begin to look at the economic costs. And so some of these estimates come from Andrew Haldane, who is in charge of the financial stability for the Bank of England. So, I mean, he's not somebody to trifle with, kind of coming up with rather exaggerated estimates. Now, governments were quick to paper over the banking crisis. And they did manage to save the global economy from going into a pronounced and severe depression, even though we have kind of recurring recessions underway. But it was at an enormous public cost. So the present Ireland debt, as one of the pigs of the Eurozone, was the result of the no longer Irish Prime Minister unilaterally declaring that the government would be responsible for every single debt that was placed by private banking gamblers. And so that's kind of what happened. So when governments responded, there were kind of two forms in the way in which it tried to respond to keep the economy going at a global scale. So the first has been called Wall Street Keynesianism. So governments create a bunch of money through quantitative easing. They give it to the banks at very, very low interest rates. The banks are supposed to give it out to consumers and lend to companies to sort of jumpstart that real economy of production and consumption. But the only problem is companies are sitting on surpluses. Certainly the consumers in high-income countries are mired in debt and are not buying. And so instead the banks keep investing it in derivatives in this funny money kind of economic system, even including in food futures, which is one of the reasons why food prices spiked up. Now the irony here is that governments who bailed out the banks then have to borrow back from the money that they transferred to the banks at 1% or thereabouts. They have to borrow back at much higher rates because the bond rating agencies have now said you're in debt and it's going to cost you more to borrow. And as a recent study by the International Labour Organization pointed out, it says that the banks have become very profitable very quickly. Now, one other, and then we kind of take a look at about the second government response, which I think Australia is suffering from as well as Canada. And that's now the austerity regime. So somehow governments around the world need to retain competitiveness in the global economy and regain the confidence of the financial markets that sort of kind of fell apart in the first place and created the crisis through this whole set of programs of austerity, which is very much like structural adjustment revisited. It's neoliberalism 1.0. But this time, what we're finding here with this is that I would call it neoliberalism 3.0. So it's really austerity for the poor. So the tenets of structural adjustment of neoliberalism 1.0 have now come to occupy the state. And at the risk of being a bit provocative, I would say it's the only successful Occupy movement that we've actually seen since the 2007 crisis. And austerity is not happening only in the Eurozone or in countries like Canada and Australia, both of which I would add do not have structural deficits. This is an ideological decision. It is neither an economic nor a theory-based or evidence-based decision in the austerity that we're seeing. But it's happening worldwide. So some work now that looking at across different countries and across the developing world, the low and middle income countries, we're seeing economic contractions. We're seeing contractions in economic spending. We're seeing decreases in the very sorts of kind of post-crisis public spending that's needed to restart that economy of production and consumption. Now, this may seem a long way. This bit may seem a long way in terms of looking at the issues of globalization and trade, but of course it's not. Since the contractions in consumption in high-income countries that are now mired in public and private debt leads to contractions in production in low and middle income countries and a slowing in the global growth of global trade. And we have seen declines in global trade as a consequence. At issue is that this austerity agenda of reining back on public spending is simply wrong on 3 counts. It absolves those responsible for the crisis and thereby kind of leads to a moral hazard. It directly imperils social cohesion and the health of many affected countries. And it ignores that when private spending dries up, it's really public spending that needs to do the heavy lifting to restart production and consumption. And to put this issue into some context, in terms of what we've also seen over the last 10, 20, or 30 years of this kind of trade-ruled, investment-ruled, kind of deregulated global economy, massive increases in inequalities and wealth, almost at a scale that is unfathomable, it's almost hard to grasp. In the UK, for example, where the government response is to cut salaries, cut spending, really begin to eviscerate what had been the country's sort of bellwether welfare state, the FTSE 100 CEOs in 2012 alone saw an increase in 27% in their take-home pay. Now, the amount of elite income that is stored in these offshore financial centers, a euphemism for a tax haven, which many high-income countries after the 2007 crisis clamored to say we're going to try to shut down, it's actually risen by 1/3 since 2007. And the wealth of billionaires went up 20% in 2012 alone, and Forbes magazine described it as a very good year for billionaires. Now, why do inequalities matter? Sharon touched on that a little bit. They matter because they can lead to decreases in social cohesion and kind of just basically kind of keeping countries and people together as a sense of people. There is some evidence, although it's still a bit disputed, about how income inequalities are also directly related to health inequalities within and across countries. But from a purely economic perspective, it takes far more growth to trickle down to poverty reduction under conditions of high inequality. And poverty reduction can be accomplished much more efficiently by very tiny or modest amounts of income and wealth distribution. But the global economy is dynamic, and with substantial geographic shifts underway. And another of the reasons why regional trade treaties have become so popular is to sort of tap into what's been described as the rise of the South and new consumer markets. Yeah, things are changing. And the points on this slide indicate that they're changing fairly dramatically. But are we witnessing a globalization of equitable development or a globalization of economic elites? And more profoundly, and I don't know the answer for this, so I'm raising it as a question, does the rise in growth and economic clout of many of these low and middle income countries, and the BRICS in particular, does it represent a tectonic shift in the economic power of these countries, or simply the deterritorialization of capital? And I raise that question because most trade is intra-firm. It's not between countries, it's between branches of the same transnational. Most investment in the BRICS flows through tax haven countries. And much of it represents the wealth of elites or corporates, bodies that are still located in high-income countries, now joined by a smaller group of elites who have benefited by these development of global production chains and outsourcing and investments in the low and middle income countries. So the fundamental question is the extent to which trade is actually leading us into an equitable form of economic development on its own terms, not simply just around the health angle, but on its own terms, or how much is it actually kind of fueling this kind of deterritorialized, denationalized group of global elites. There remains then the ecological limits to growth as a means of poverty reduction. So one particular study here from the UK, no credible socially just or ecologically sustainable scenario of continually growing incomes for a world of 9 billion people. The UNDP in its 2013 report commented somewhat speciously or facetiously when it noted that high Human Development Index countries have excessively high ecological footprints. To quote the UNDP, this does not bode well for the future. An extensive understatement. There's also some trade-specific dimensions of disputes that have successfully challenged country subsidies for green technology, which raises the interesting question, should mercantilism trump sustainability or the prospect of survival? Probably many of us think it should not, but this means we really have to begin to look at the structure and nature of these trade treaties. Now, this session is really kind of to focus, this day is really focusing on one particular trade treaty and on the food outcomes that are associated with that. Now, trade has long been a vector for disease, especially for infectious disease. Many of us probably realize that the term for quarantine came from medieval Italian cities where they made the ships that were coming with foreign products stay in port, along with the sailors and the captain on board, for 40 days to see whether or not anybody died. And if they didn't die, then we would allow the goods to sort of come into the country. But trade could also be considered a vector for non-communicable diseases. And I think we need to sort of even change our thinking that these are not non-communicable diseases because they have communicable vectors. So what's the world's most well-recognized symbol? And if you voted for the Golden Arches, then you're absolutely correct. And this slide comes from a colleague of mine, David Saunders, who's working with some of the people here in this room as well on the kind of diet nutrition project. And as he just kind of points out here is that one of the things that we're witnessing is this explosion of obesity and overweight in low and middle income countries, and that can be linked fairly directly to liberalization in commodities, and most importantly, to foreign direct investment in food production, because it's not simply, it doesn't make sense for transnational companies to send finished products into countries that have productive capacities where they could just invest into the productive capacities and produce it more locally. So now, we also see this in terms of tobacco, and I really love Gary Larson in his Paleolithic period. The good news we know is that in many high-income countries, smoking rates have declined, teenage smoking rates have declined, and the gender gap in terms of teenage smoking rates have equalized, have also become very small. But we realize, of course, that the tobacco transnationals are in hot pursuit of new markets in low and middle income countries. And this led to the development of the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. But we also know, and it will be discussed a little bit more this afternoon, we know about the tobacco transnational companies sort of hitting back, trying to use trade and investment treaties as a way of reducing the space for governments to regulate in ways that are consistent with what they all agreed to do under the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. So by way of summary, as I said, this was the view from 36,000 feet, so we've run across a whole range of gamuts around globalization, trade, investment, and health. So we really do need to try to look and find ways to harness trade for equitable human and health development, and to recall that trade, even in the founding charter, the Marrakesh Charter that birthed the WTO, trade is defined as a means to an end, not as an end in itself. Liberalization is a means to an end, not an end in itself. Growth is a means to an end, not an end to itself. And we have to keep pointing that out, because people who begin to work in the trade sector become, just as we are in the health sector, sort of infused with kind of issues and moral stands and understandings around health equity, in the trade sector, liberalization becomes conflated from being a means to an end in itself. So we have to keep kind of reminding, what are we trying to do together? What is the purpose of this together? Ensure that trade rules work for and not against ecological sustainability, re-regulate banking, reintroduce cross-border capital controls, and that has some implication. There's a move towards this. Increasingly now, even the IMF is saying, well, maybe cross-border capital controls are useful. But then let's take a look and see, how is this playing out in the TPPA in terms of opening up or reducing? What are the regulatory possibilities over capital controls? And then abandon the austerity agenda. It's simply not working, and to recognize that we do not have in most countries a fiscal crisis, we have a taxation crisis. And I could give you a different presentation that shows you historically what has happened in taxation revenues against global economic growth, and that we have now huge slurping amounts of real financial capital sitting in private hands, far more than we had even just 10 years ago. And that's because our taxation and redistribution policies have not kept pace with global economic growth. And then for health, okay, it's not a case of being either pro-trade or anti-trade. And when I got into this work about 20 years ago, it was pretty common in the health sector, you know, to sort of run campaigns about down with the WTO and no trade, et cetera, et cetera. Well, that's not really the issue. Because we've always traded. It's about really examining critically the terms of trade and how those terms are established and what the implications are through the pathways, some of which Sharon identified. So it's who benefits and who does not. What regulatory policy space do governments have that is essential for health? How is that protected around intellectual property rights, government procurement, expansion in services? Also, what are the foregone costs? What are governments having to spend, especially low-income governments, in trade facilitation costs, in foregone tariffs revenues, and many low-income countries rely upon that. Past experiences with liberalization hasn't formalized economies in many low-income and middle-income countries, so they're losing that ability to tax labor. What do they have to rely on if they lose the revenue base through tariffs, value-added or consumption taxes, which even the World Bank recognizes now is stretched as far as they can go throughout, for example, the continent of Africa. Now, for trade, it's not about making health the only objective, but recognizing that it is one important policy goal that should be present within trade negotiations or trade treaties. Always bearing in mind, how can a trade treaty be developed? How can it be stated? What kind of elements could go into it that protect the necessary policy space and flexibility for public health regulation? Now, that's stuff that we're going to be dealing with in much more detail later this morning and this afternoon. But before we engage in that, I want to take us back to this most pressing issue, and that's that of the impending environmental collapse and how we cannot sacrifice the ecological to the short-term growth and trade gains. So as an earlier global species warned us, another one of Gary Larson's cartoons in his Paleolithic period, the picture is pretty bleak, gentlemen. The world's climates are changing, the mammals are taking over, and we all have a brain about the size of a walnut. Well, our brains have now grown well beyond the walnut size, but we have only limited time to use this expansive cognitive growth wisely in order to improve how we govern our global economic growth. Thank you.